Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. What I would like to try and do is talk a little bit about the United Nations, and then I'd be delighted to try and answer your questions on more general subjects relating to U.S. foreign and national security policy. And because you know better than I do what you want to hear, I'm going to try and keep my opening remarks fairly brief, although I do have a couple of points I think it's important to lay out for you. On the topic of the long road ahead for UN reform. You know, today is the 30th anniversary of the General Assembly's vote declaring Zionism as a form of racism. 30 years ago, the General Assembly made quite possibly the worst single decision that it has ever made. And the impact of that decision brought home to many Americans the problems that had developed within the UN system, and stressed how far the UN had moved from the ideals of its founders. Now, one of my proudest moments in government service was 16 years ago under President Bush 41's administration, when the United States, along with many other countries, led an effort that resulted in the repeal of the Zionism is Racism resolution. But the fact was that the adoption of the resolution in the first place was an outrage. An outrage. And it wasn't just that resolution that caused the outrage, it was the underlying sentiments, the culture, if you will, of the organization as a whole that led to it. And the fact that it took 16 years, and a lot of effort, I can tell you that, to repeal it, had an enormous impact on American public opinion, an impact that continues today. I just think it's important to recall, as we meet here today, 30 years after the adoption of Zionism as racism, that the resolution itself was adopted on the anniversary date of Kristallnacht in Germany. And what a coincidence that was. So, you know, the idea that that history moves in long cycles, I think, is one that has a lot of appeal, and it is important to understand, important for our friends and allies from foreign countries to understand why, when they inquire as to American opinions about the United Nations, it's so colored by things like the passage of the Zionism is Racism resolution, the impact of which, as I say, has not completely disappeared, even though we repealed the resolution now some 14 years ago. I thought, I'm accused of a lot of things, I'm rarely accused of naivete, but 14 years ago, when we repealed Zionism as racism, I thought, well, that's the end of that. That means Israel can now be treated as a normal nation in the UN, not as another punching bag, a surrogate for the United States, which in many respects it is. But today we find that Israel is still not treated as a completely normal nation. I like to say there are three categories of countries in the United Nations. There are permanent members of the Security Council, 5 so far. There are elected members, non-permanent members of the Security Council. And then there's a third category of nations. It consists of one, a permanent non-member of the Security Council, that being the State of Israel. We were happy that Israel this fall finally did declare its candidacy for the Security Council for a term beginning, I think, in the year 2018, which reflects that it still takes some time for the process to work its way through. But anniversary dates are important in human life. They symbolize a lot of things that are difficult to put into words. So just remember today that 30 years ago, the General Assembly declared Zionism to be a form of racism. And that brings me to the Oil for Food program. Now, you know, the Oil for Food program was intended to be a program to deliver humanitarian assistance to the people of Iraq to mitigate some of the effects of the sanctions regime that we put in after Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that was maintained even after American-led forces threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And yet we have found through the extensive investigation conducted by former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker that the Oil for Food program embodied a course of corruption and mismanagement, the full extent of which has yet to be explored. The Volcker Commission did a substantial amount of work. It's produced 5 reports, some of which are doorstop size and weight. I have to say I haven't read all 5 of them completely yet. I'm still working my way through them, and it's not pleasant reading. It's not pleasant reading at all. And yet, within the confines of the UN complex on First Avenue, it's hard to have a discussion about the recommendations of the Volcker Commission. It's hard to have conversations about the mismanagement and corruption that were uncovered by the Volcker Commission. And we all know more remains to be done. There are 3 congressional committees that continue to investigate the Oil for Food program. There are at least a couple of grand juries in this country. There are criminal investigations in a number of other countries. So far, for example, a former French permanent representative to the UN has been arrested. That certainly caught my attention. And there are other investigations that are proceeding as well. In India, we have seen the resignation of their foreign minister as a result of this scandal. And yet, one of my colleagues, another ambassador from Latin America, and I had a conversation just a few weeks ago, and he said, you know, we are losing sight of the Volcker Commission. We don't have a mechanism in place to follow through on its recommendations, and he came up with the idea that we may well follow through on to get this item on the General Assembly agenda as a separate topic of discussion. Because the thing about the Oil for Food scandal that makes it important is that it did not arise out of thin air. The mismanagement and the corruption that we've seen in the program came out of an existing culture on First Avenue. Now, when Chairman Volcker recently testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was asked whether his investigation turned up what the particular senator asking the question described as a culture of corruption at the UN. And Chairman Volcker paused and said, "No, I wouldn't call it a culture of corruption, although there is corruption at the UN." He said, "I'd call it a culture of inaction." A culture of inaction. Now, this is not Jesse Helms speaking here. This is Paul Volcker, a man who has risen to the highest levels of public service in our country, and who began his investigation of the Oil for Food program not really expecting to find what he did, as he has testified in Congress, but whose conclusion at the end of this exhaustive work is that he has been examining a culture of inaction. And that is something that I am personally quite gravely concerned about as we look here over the next several months, attempting to put into practice many of the reforms in the UN that have been discussed in recent years. We just had a summit here in New York of over 150 heads of state and government who attended. I'm sure those of you who are New Yorkers remember it as one of the all-time traffic jams here in the city. We also remember it at the UN because the leaders endorsed a 35-page single-space statement, which we poetically called the outcome document, that listed a whole series of steps that the leaders agreed upon, or at least their subordinates agreed upon them. If we took a test of the 150 leaders of who had read all 35 single spaces of inspirational prose that we had written. I'm not sure that we would find high test scores, but in any event, this document produced a whole series of recommendations. I have to say, on many of those that are of a high priority to the United States in the area of management reform, I think we are in jeopardy of not seeing them enacted. And I will give you one example in particular that has very high profile in the U.S. Congress. I think has a high profile among people who follow foreign policy generally in this country, and that's our effort to reform the UN Human Rights Commission. The organization that should be the highest level decision-making body on human rights within the UN system, but which has been characterized in recent years by having as its chairman Libya and having as two of its stalwart members Cuba and Zimbabwe. Now you say, how is this possible? Well, it's possible because of the way countries get elected to organizations like the Human Rights Commission in the UN system through regional groups that promote their candidacies, and frequently they're elected by unanimity. We have said, and it's our objective, that we eliminate the UN Human Rights Commission, create a new Human Rights Council that will be that hopefully will be immune from the deficiencies of the existing Human Rights Commission. I don't know that we're going to achieve this objective. There's substantial opposition to it. That was reflected in the negotiations that led to the outcome document at the summit. And I'm not sure that opposition hasn't grown stronger in the 2 months since then. We're still engaged in a major effort to accomplish this by the end of the year. But we are seeing, I think, in the real world, the culture of inaction that Chairman Volcker talked about. And you will be able to judge whether, on December the 31st, the Human Rights Commission has been abolished and this new mechanism is put in place, whether those of us, and there are many countries, obviously, in addition to the United States, that want to fix the broken UN human rights mechanism, you will be able to judge whether we have succeeded or whether the culture of inaction has triumphed again. Secretary Rice, in her speech to the General Assembly 2 months ago, called for a revolution of reform in the UN. Now, it's not often that a U.S. Secretary of State calls for revolution, but I think that is indicative of the strength of her feeling and the President's feeling of how much work needs to be done. So we will see whether the revolution of reform or the culture of inaction prevails, whether when the irresistible force meets the immovable object, what the result is. And I would just say stay tuned on that score. So now I've started off, I've been critical of the United Nations, and I'm sure there are many people saying, well, when is he going to say something nice about the United Nations? And here it comes. The United States, I think, has had some success in the past several years, predating my arrival, I hasten to say, in a number of areas that are quite important to U.S. national security interest, working through the United Nations. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, starting with the very successful efforts over the past year in particular to try and effectively evict Syria from Lebanon, to return Lebanon to full sovereignty and control over its own territory, restore its democratic institutions, and get the Syrian grip off the country removed. In a number of resolutions that the Security Council has adopted, where the United States and France have worked very closely together, culminating in most recently in a report by the Secretary General's Special Representative, Terje Royd-Larsen. Syrian troops have been withdrawn from the country, and steps have been taken to allow free and fair